We are writing daily to find your solution. We are on a mission to solve all your problems. Zeros are the day. Daily solutions. Podcast we are here to stay. Weehaw!
Okay. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, this is Graham.
This is Ashkahn.
And today's question is, I've been hearing a lot about the Model Aquatic Health Code. What is it, and should I be worried?
Yeah, so this is definitely one of the kind of bigger new developments in the world of float tank regulations that you probably, have been hearing a lot about in the last year-ish. That
Must have been hiding under a little salt rock somewhere,
So I guess let's break it down a little bit before we get into any of the float tank stuff. What is the Model Aquatic Health Code? So the Model Aquatic Health Code is what's called a model code, and it's kind of formed by the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, and it's basically kind of the answer to what they define as the problem of there being a huge variety of pool and spa or recreational water, as they define it, kind of codes around the United States and even around Canada and other parts of the world. But, right now every state has their own pool code, and sometimes counties have their own pool codes, and, there can be differences from state to state and city to city, and every place has to update their code and keep it up to date with new information. And, that can kind of fall behind when you have so many different organizations, so many different health departments, some of whom are for small areas that don't have a ton of budgeting and stuff like that to be constantly, researching stuff and keeping their code up to date. And, the results are that, for one thing, you do find different codes from place to place. And also sometimes health codes or pool requirements have been updated in areas for 20 years, 25 years as a result of it just being a kind of expensive and difficult process to go through. And so, in an attempt to solve this problem or to kind of make everything a little bit easier on everybody, there's been this push to create model codes. So, it's kind of an interesting thing to think about, because in your head, you'd think maybe we could just create like a federal pool code that just happened on the national level.
And that is totally, absolutely not how things are done here in the United States.
So it's not like the federal government is making a pool and spa code that every state has to follow. Instead, what's happening is some organization, and this is not the only model code that exists. There are other ones from pool and spa associations and stuff like that. But this does seem to be the one that's actually kind of gaining the most traction and people are looking at. So the CDC has created this model code that they call the Model Aquatic Health Code. And basically, they take that document that they've written up that they think is basically just a really awesome pool code. It's up to date. It kind of based on, modern research. It has a lot thought throughout it. It's kind of relying on a bunch of expertise and all this stuff, right? So they put this document together that they think is super awesome, and they put it on the internet, on a website. And that's as much authority, like actual legal authority, as it actually has. Like, it is literally just like a PDF on a website.
Kind of like this podcast. It's just one big suggestion,
And that's as far as it goes. Like, the CDC can't actually enforce it as a document as themselves, an organization. And what they're hoping happens is that different states will look at this PDF on a website and they'll read through it and they'll be like, wow, that's some freaking awesome pool code. Like, it's way better than our pool code. Like, it's up to date.
Bring it over here.
Yeah, and they'll be like, what we should do is we should ditch our pool code and replace it with this, the Model Aquatic Health Code. And the more states or counties or, health departments out there that look at this and go like, yeah, like, give me some of that Model Aquatic Health Code and replace their language with it, the more you have created that uniformity you were looking for. Right now, there's like all these different places that are pulling their information from one source. And as the Model Aquatic Health Code updates, hopefully they'll keep their stuff updated as well. And they don't have to rely on kind of internally making sure, they're responding to new information or new data that's coming out. They can kind of rely on a single source that's doing a bit more vetting of information. So that's kind of the logic behind why this exists. And I think what they're going for as a document.
Yep, and it should be noted, too, that when the states adopt them, they can adopt it in whole. It still has to go through this kind of whole process of what you'd put pool and spa code into effect with as the state. So there's a big internal process that just goes into that adoption. And even when they adopt it, they can decide, again, to take everything in whole, or they can just take parts of it and say, these parts make sense. Some other stuff we want to do like we've always done it. We're not going to include these sections. So they can take it and just totally piecemeal, except parts or sections of it.
Or just take inspiration from it, not take any of the actual language, but be like, hey, this is a good idea. We're gonna implement it, but we're gonna kind of implement it in our own way. So there's really any level of influence, or they could completely ignore it. I mean, that's the other thing to consider. Like, not states might look at this and be like, nah, we're just gonna, we got a good thing going.
We got
here.
it.
Yeah. So it's when you talk about the impact this could have, or how fast this could roll out, or who it would apply to, or these kind of much more concrete questions that I think people have, especially with this float tank stuff we'll start getting into, it can kind of be hard to answer them because we don't know. Like, we don't know how much people are going to look at this language, adopt it, take inspiration from it, ignore it, implement it, but implement it 10 years from now, implement it, but grandfather people in. Like, there's so many different scenarios in terms of the kind of reach that something in the Model Aquatic Health Code has.
And just to take a time out right now, I should say, too, that Ashkahn played a pretty large role dialoguing back and forth with people in the CMAC, the Council for the Model Aquatic Health Code, about lots of the float tank code that has now been voted to be included in there, which we'll get to a little later. So if I seem to be sitting on the sideline and mainly cracking jokes during this process, it's because Ashkahn is much more officially educated on this than I am. So I apologize, listeners, but
the jokes the jokes add some spice.
Thanks, buddy. I appreciate it. Anyway, I'll let Ashkahn go back to monologuing now, and you'll hear me chime in occasionally.
Okay, so still before we jump into the actual float tank stuff, the other thing to consider is just a little bit about where the Model Aquatic Health Code itself is as a document, in terms of how widespread it is. And it's actually kind of interesting to look at. There's actually so far only one state in the United States that has fully adopted the Model Aquatic Health Code, which is New Mexico. And it took them like 3 years or something, 3.5 years, I think, to actually do it, from the part to get it through their legislative process and all the things they have to do to make it kind of, official regulations. And there's a few other states that are kind of on the path there, and there's certain like districts or counties that are working on it, and there's other places that have adopted parts of it, or again, like I said, are just taking inspiration from it. But it's not like half the states in the country have fully adopted the Model Aquatic Health Code, and this language is currently already very uniform. And another one of the reasons for that is that this is pretty new. This, not just the float tank stuff, the whole thing is a relatively new concept. Version 1 of the Model Aquatic Health Code came out, I think in 2014, so not that long ago. And we're currently on version 2, and version 3 is coming out this summer. So just as a concept in the pool and spa world, this is amongst the kind of newest developments that's happening.
I mean, even when we go out to these conferences, there's a fair amount of talks about the Model Aquatic Health Code, and oftentimes they even start how we do when we're talking about float tanks. How many people are very familiar with this or have read through it, and there's people just who are health regulators who aren't very familiar with the Model Aquatic Health Code at all. So even within the pool world, there's still a large amount of education and adoption still to go from their standpoint.
Sure. So, okay, now we can actually talk about the float tank stuff. How do float tanks fit into any of this? Well, what happens is the Model Aquatic Health Code goes through a routine update process. It used to be every 2 years. They just switched it to every 3 years. And in this update process, people can submit new changes or edits. There's things they want to see either added to or changed in the current Model Aquatic Health Code language. And this last round of updates, which happened last year, 2017, basically had a huge new section that was aiming to include float tanks into this document with regulation written about them. And that was the process Graham was mentioning that, I played a big part in, and other people in the industry played a big part in. And the process, wrote up the language that they thought would be good rules for float tanks. And then the whole thing went up for vote. And people who were like members of the Model Aquatic Health Code or the Council for the Model Aquatic Health Code got to discuss it and vote it in or vote it out. And we just found out not too long ago that it got voted in. So this thing has actually been voted in. It wasn't that huge of a landslide or anything. It was, I think, around like 60-40 of it being voted in, which is a lot of the stuff, if you see the changes in there, got voted in at like 90% or above, or voted out 90% or above. And I will say too, there's one final step that actually needs to happen. The CDC itself needs to actually like give a final approval for everything. So there's a chance, I'd probably say a smaller chance, that the whole thing gets rejected before we ever see it actually implemented. But it is voted in now, and that basically means that, again, as long as the CDC approves it, they're going to write it into their next version of the Model Aquatic Health Code, which will be released in July of this year, 2018. And again, that's the point where it just becomes a PDF on a website, right? So now we have to, from that point, before this has any impact on anybody, a health department has to look at that document and decide they want to either adopt it as regulation, they want to adopt it as a guideline, which is usually a faster process than regulation, but slightly less enforceable. They want to just take inspiration from it. They read it and say, oh, this is great float tank language. I'm going to write my float tank language kind of based off this logic. Or they decide to completely ignore it, right? Kind of all those things are options. Or they decide to adopt it and grandfather existing people in. There's all these different directions that it can go.
And it's interesting to me, specifically the float tank side, how that plays out. I mean, I have no idea how it will, but the fact that float tanks are so weird and new, and that a lot of people don't have any pre-existing float tank code in their state or county pool codes, means maybe that whole like inspiration side of things plays a much bigger role in this one, even in just inspiring them to pay more attention to float tanks or something like that. Anyway, it's I think that we're in a weirder position in that divide between adoption and inspiration and all of that being float tanks than a lot of pool code, where it's likely, again, that people already have this certain way they're doing it or something like that.
Yeah, there's definitely a certain kind of like filling the vacuum thing that might happen. Like we might see the float tank section specifically get adopted much faster than other stuff in the Model Aquatic Health Code because it's not replacing their existing practices. It's just filling a gap, And I can totally see a health department representative finding out float tanks are opening their area, having no idea what to do about it, finding that the Center for Disease Control has, officially made a set of rules to keep float tanks safe, and being like, great, done, like I don't have to worry about this. I can just grab this language. Like I could totally see the kind of reality of something like that happening. So what's in there? What is the float tank language? So before they actually release their language in version 3, you can still read what got voted in and what will end up in the Model Aquatic Health Code language. If you go to the CMAQ's website, which is just cmac.org, you should see in the left column something called change requests, which is where all the like edits are, and something where you can hit view change requests, or you can just type into Google CMAQ view change request, and it'll give you a direct link to it. And then in that search box, if you type in flotation, you'll actually see the little change request about all the float tank language. You can click on that, and you can actually read what the language is. And it's a bit lengthy. It's like 15 pages or something like that. And one of the reasons is because we kind of fought hard for everything that they wanted to apply to float tanks to be written in specifically in the float tank section. Because what we didn't want to happen is them to just reference other sections of the Model Aquatic Health Code. Like float tanks also have to follow this section. Because what can happen then is in the future, they could update those sections, and their updates might make sense for pools and spas, but might not make sense for float tanks. But because it's by default applying to all that stuff, we could end up in some weird situations.
And I'm gonna take that for a second and unpack it into layman's terms, because in this case, I think I'm closer to a layman myself, which is just, so it started with just a relatively short document, but then that document, as does much of the Model Aquatic Health Code, referenced other big parts of the Model Aquatic Health Code, saying, oh, when you include skimmers, pay attention to the skimmer section, right? But then it would say things, but only these sections of the skimmer section, because some of this stuff obviously only applies to pools. So, take these 3 parts of the skimmer section and then include that, and then the skimmer section would reference other things. And at some point, we're just like, we can't even pay attention to the interdependencies here, So that's why it turned into this argument to actually take that language from other parts of the Model Aquatic Health Code and include it directly in what now turned out to be a relatively lengthy 15-page edition. So again, just a little non-technical summary of that.
So yeah, some of that stuff is just copied and pasted of other sections of the Model Aquatic Health Code, and some of it is copy and pasted with kind of like some minor changes to it.
And then there's that one fart joke that we managed to sneak in there.
It really got section 1.3.9.4. But so there's a lot, there's a lot in there, and a lot of it is probably not that crazy, right? Some of it's just like health departments are allowed to permit you, and like you need to get a permit from your health department, like real kind of basic language. And but then there's other things in there that are decently impactful on float centers, and some of them are things that I think a lot of people in the industry would look favorably upon. Some of the biggest ones are the fact that chlorine and bromine are not required, and in fact not really recommended in the language. It specifically says that you can use either a UV system or an ozone system, or a combination of the two, to be able to keep your float tanks clean.
Which is
huge, right? I mean,
I mean, as far as the number one thing that I've heard centers that are just opening complain about and butt heads with their health departments the most about, that's pretty much it. You know, like they don't want to use chlorine or bromine, and the health department absolutely is not going to let them open unless they do. So having it written in that people are allowed to not only allowed to use alternative methods, but are recommended to use something like UV or ozone is humongous.
Yeah, and it might mean that those states that are sticking by chlorine won't adopt the Model Aquatic Health Code.
Or just won't adopt that portion. Right. Again, like they could adopt every other part of it and just say, and you know what, chlorine's also required. Again, because they can do it in part or in whole or whatever they want.
But, I mean, the very fact that the Model Aquatic Health Code came out with that language is a lot stronger of an argument than you as a float center trying to convince your health department, you know? So that part I think a lot of people would look favorably upon. There is some confusion about hydrogen peroxide. You're not supposed to use hydrogen peroxide as a disinfectant, which makes sense, right? So that means you're not just putting hydrogen peroxide into the float tank and relying on that to keep everything safe. But you can use hydrogen peroxide as long as you call it an oxidizer or a water clarifier. And so, you know, as long as you're going about this the right way and saying the right terms, that means a UV hydrogen peroxide kind of system is actually allowable in this Model Aquatic Health Code language.
Yep, and the UV in this case, of course, is the actual disinfector, the sanitizer.
Right,
and
that's the thing that's doing the disinfecting or the ozone. Other things that I think people would probably look favorably upon, there's a requirement for 3 turnovers. That can be less than what some health departments are going for nowadays, 4 or 5 turnovers. Stuff like that can have a big impact on your equipment. There's not a requirement for NSF certified pumps. I know some people hit that problem where they can't have a magnetically driven pump because it's supposed to be NSF certified, and NSF certified magnetic pumps don't really appear on the market. Exist. There's not a requirement for an NSF certified filter, so that leaves rooms for bag filters and stuff like that some manufacturers use. There's definitely kind of some leeway in there on things that some people don't get leeway on when they're working with their health departments. And probably the biggest thing of kind of impact that people might notice if this were actually to be adopted and kind of enforced on you in terms of your center is the actual requirements for ozone and UV and what they're looking for out of an ozone and a UV system. And with UV specifically, the requirements are a few things that may not make exact sense to you right away, but
it's all very complicated.
The big ones really in there are a requirement for a calibrated sensor and that the UV light passes the NSF 50's disinfection efficacy testing. So those two are things that most likely your UV system in your float tank has not done or does not have. Like most manufacturers are selling equipment that will not meet those requirements. And part of the problem is that the UV systems that do meet those requirements tend to be in the like $10,000 range. And that's kind of the biggest hurdle that I think you've heard a lot of people talking about with the Model Aquatic Health Code. Once the language really got kind of edited to its final form, that's really one of the biggest things in there is that to get a UV light that would actually meet the requirements is currently a pretty expensive proposition. And that's for a few reasons.
And just to back up really quickly. So you mentioned right there that there's this requirement that it meet the NSF 50 disinfection efficacy testing. But there's not actually a requirement that it be NSF 50 certified itself for the UV lamp. Do you want to just for people who aren't as familiar, you want to break that down a little further?
So yeah, like you can take your UV light, you take it to this organization, the NSF, and they would like certify. They put it through this whole testing process, and a lot of commercial UV systems have gone through that and are NSF certified. And the problem is that can be a really expensive process. So usually the systems you see certified, NSF 50 certified, are pretty expensive, big, serious commercial UV systems. And when you see kind of the smaller residential units that these companies sell, they usually don't go through the trouble of paying to have it NSF 50 certified because it's not worth the expense for them. So this language is a little bit more flexible than that. You don't actually have to have your UV system certified to all the requirements that are in NSF 50. You just have to have the testing part of it, the part where they actually test that your UV light can kill the certain bacteria Their disinfection efficacy testing. That's the test they want to see passed. And you don't actually have to have it tested at NSF or anything. You just need any kind of ANSI, some accredited lab.
Send it into the Daily Solutions podcast, we'll throw it through the ringer,
to show that it's passed that test. So there is flexibility in the language there, and in some cases that does come in useful. And in reality, a lot of times, if you're going to find a unit that's passed that test, it's probably the units that have been certified. So it's, usually those things kind of go hand in hand, and it still kind of pegs you into that corner a little bit. And the other part of it, the calibrated sensor, is another interesting one. So that's an actual sensor that will be able to, detect the UV waves that are going through the solution in your UV system, and it measures them kind of on the other side of that. And so the idea of having a sensor in your UV system is so that if your light bulb starts to diminish in terms of its power that it's putting out, or if there's cloudiness in your water, turbidity or anything, or if there's something built up on the quartz sleeve or whatever other encasing you have for your UV bulb, all those things can lower the amount of UV, the effective UV that's actually influencing, in your system, and can actually lower the amount of disinfection you're doing. And so the sensor is there to be able to pick up on all that and say yes, everything, it's the light bulb is working fine, and your sleeve is clean enough that the UV waves are getting through it, and the liquid itself is has a high enough transmission that the UV waves are getting through that effectively as well. And so that's kind of giving you a live readout confidence that the system's working correctly. And there's other ways to deal with some of that stuff, like the UV bulbs usually can have control systems in the UV unit itself called a ballast that'll be able to detect if the UV bulb's not getting enough power. And you can also do routine cleaning of your UV sleeves and stuff like that to make sure that you're following all the best practices, and that these problems that could lower the amount of effectiveness that the UV is having, you're avoiding by doing proper maintenance.
And one of the suggestions that we had as we were going through this process, and that we actually tried to get some of the language in there changed to, was some of those preventative maintenance protocols, and also just taking samples of your water in for regular lab testing, bacteriological testing, to make sure that they're staying clean and that your tanks are, not getting people sick, basically. And the interesting part, I guess, too, is that, the calibrated sensor stuff, all of this stuff about the UV wasn't just added in because of extra concern about float tanks specifically. This is kind of language that they're trying to add into the Model Aquatic Health Code wherever UV lights are used.
They really get everybody onto this.
This is like a Model Aquatic Health Code thing, that they want to have those sensors on all the UV lights, because in their mind it's the easiest, best guarantee that the lights are working properly and actually doing the disinfecting that they should be.
Yeah, and really the unfortunate thing is just the cost, in my mind. If it wasn't for the cost, it kind of makes sense to me. I understand why you'd want to have sensors. There's all sorts of maintenance and testing and stuff like that can give you confidence, but there's definitely another level of confidence that comes from continuously monitoring something and always having a readout telling you that it's fine.
Oh, yeah. If it were a $100 part that we could attach to a UV unit, we would have them on all of ours too,
Because there's other factors with UV too that you're hoping your manufacturer did their research into, but, UV lights sometimes they take 10, 15 minutes to warm up before they're actually hitting their kind of effective output. So if you have a UV unit like that, and you're just running it for 15 minutes between every person, you might never actually be getting to the point where it's putting out the proper amount of millijoules. So that's, that can be prevented by your manufacturer making sure they purchase the right part and having tested that themselves. But there's something nice about having a quantifiable readout. The problem is the sensors tend to be $1,000 in terms of having a part. And the units they build those expensive parts into are, again, these big commercial units. And sometimes, and part of the expense comes from, having these extra sensors, having it go through some sort of certification. But another part of the expense comes from the fact that these units are usually built for things much bigger than float tanks. They're built for 100, 500,000 gallon pools, and they're built for flow rates of 100, 150 gallons per minute. And as a result, they're much bigger than we probably need on float tanks. So there is also a possibility that we might see some UV units that meet these requirements, that someone builds more appropriately sized for float tanks, that might come at a lower cost than this $10,000 range. If someone really tries to specifically make one for the right flow rate we're doing and stuff like that, the price could come down. I doubt it's going to come down to the cost of what UV systems I see a lot of float tanks using, $800, $900 systems.
$1,200, $2,000, kind of that range.
So that's just a tricky one. And again, we'll see if states actually decide that this is important, or if they decide that this is kind of overkill and float tanks just aren't really risky enough of an environment for to warrant having that expensive equipment on there. And that would just be kind of to be determined. But that's definitely the biggest, most impactful thing, I think, that's kind of in this language. And I'd say the other one is that they have for new centers, so this only applies to new construction in the Model Aquatic Health Code. They do want to see float tanks being kind of VGB compliant. So that usually means having 2 separate inlets rather than just one that some float tanks come with. So that's another one that you may see, but in their language, it specifically just applies to new centers, as opposed to the UV thing, which if someone just adopted the Model Aquatic Health Code, word for word, would actually apply to existing centers as well, meaning existing centers would have to go, buy new UV equipment and install it in their tanks.
Yeah, you'd need some kind of written exception or variance to get by that if it just got adopted.
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot. That's a lot about the Model Aquatic Health Code. Again, the language is fully available and it's worth kind of looking through. There's a few other things in there that are interesting to read. And, we'll really just see what ends up happening with this. When it's adopted, float centers are able to convince their health departments to not follow parts of it or change the language, or, there's so many different ways that this could go down from place to place. So
yeah,
something
and
to keep your eye on.
If you want to get even deeper into it too, the entire process kind of took place between about February of 2017 up through October when it got voted on. And as a result of that, there's a bunch of changes that have been made. There's a bunch of comments on the potential on the change request before it got voted on. You can actually go back and look at those comments online too. And, you can see things from us posted up there for things we wanted to have changed, stuff from the Float Tank Association, from Jason McDonald, health regulator up in Canada. So there's this whole deeper process that happened getting to where we are now. And I guess just to review, going forward too, this won't be adopted until, or the new code won't actually go into effect until this summer. And from there, it could be years before we actually see it adopted by states, or it could be a much quicker process if they're just putting it into guidelines. So what happens from here is actually just a giant question mark. And,
like I mentioned before, the Model Aquatic Health Code has its own update process. So in 3 years, in 2020, they'll be going through another update cycle. And, anybody who wants to be a member, which includes anybody who pays their membership fee, you don't have to have any requirements, can submit their changes. If they want to see something edited in this float tank language, you can submit an edit for it, and that'll go through the process of being discussed and voted on and all that stuff for the next version of the code.
And
I think that's pretty we can kind of a decent little breakdown of the Model Aquatic Health Code.
Yeah, probably go into more depth, but let's leave it there. If you have any more questions about it, though, definitely send them in to floatanksolutions.com/podcast, and you'll give me a nice little break episode while I let Ashkahn ramble on about code language some more.
All right. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, talk to you all tomorrow.
Right.